The Dust Creek station burned crimson in the sunset, the whistle shrieking as the crowd spilled into chaos. Clara, a widowed woman of color from the East, had barely set foot before everything was gone. Her only suitcase snatched, her small frame shoved into the mud while cruel laughter rang out. Humiliated and alone, the town stared at her as if she were a stray with no place to belong. And just when Clara thought she had erred in ever-coming west, a cowboy cloaked in red dust stepped forward, his sun-worn hand reaching out. "You don't have to walk alone." But were those words her salvation, or the beginning of another fate altogether? Evening settled over Montana like a red veil of dust stretched across the town. The iron train from the east screeched to a halt, white steam curling upward, mingling with the golden rays slanting down from distant mountains. Clara Whitmore stood still in the press of the crowd on the platform, both hands clutching a battered brown suitcase, a weathered journal tied to its lid. Inside lay little more than a few plain dresses, a wool scarf, her mother's Bible, and scraps of notes from another life. Everything else had vanished the day her doctor husband was taken by the epidemic, leaving her to the cold scorn of his family and the whispers that she brought misfortune to any soul who stayed near. The train doors clanged shut behind her. Clara drew in the sharp scent of coal smoke and iron, one thought echoing in her mind. This is where I must begin again, even if no one is waiting. Boots thudded, voices barked, bodies jostled. Passengers hurried past, one clutching a leather satchel, another hefting a grain sack. Clara moved slower, her wary eyes taking in the station of the West. Dust coated everything, from warped wooden eaves to crooked fences. There were no tall buildings here, no women in fine, wide-brimmed hats like those back east. Here men wore guns at their hips, dark clothes hanging loose, their gait heavy with swagger. Women's dresses were faded, hands gripping children, faces weathered by sun and wind. Clara pulled her thin shawl tighter, stepping toward the street, when a rough hand tore the suitcase from her grasp. "Hey!" The cry burst from her lips, but no one turned. A hard-faced man was already shoving through the crowd, her suitcase under his arm. Clara bolted after him, skirts sweeping over grit and stone. But her heel caught the rail. She stumbled hard, tumbling into a patch of mud at the platform's edge. Laughter broke somewhere nearby. A woman leading a child gave her a glance and kept walking. A cowboy shook his head. "Eastern women don't last out here." Mud seeped cold through her dress, clinging to her skin. Clara braced her palms to rise, but her trembling arms slid against the earth. Shame surged like a flood, no hand reaching out, no face showing pity. Her heart pounded with a cruel whisper. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should never have come. And then a shadow fell across her. A pair of worn leather boots, dust-caked, stopped in front of her. A sun-browned hand, calloused from ranch work, reached down. A voice deep and steady carried over the din. "You don't have to walk alone." Clara looked up. Against the crimson sky, his face was half shielded by a wide-brimmed hat. Blue eyes, clear and quiet, held hers, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with a firmness that seemed to anchor her to the earth. She hesitated, then placed her hand in his. The touch startled her, rough yet warm, like parched ground still holding the day's sun. He drew her up without hesitation, solid and sure. Mud streaked her dress. Dust clung to her face, but Clara straightened her back, holding what little pride she had left. "Thank you," she whispered. her voice trembling from cold, and something else, something she could not name. He nodded, asking nothing more. Bending, he picked up her fallen journal, brushed off the dirt, and handed it back. Keep it close if it matters, he said. Plain words carrying quiet weight. Before Clara could answer, the train whistle screamed again, drowning the platform. The thief was long gone into the dust of the street, her belongings with him, every dress, every coin, even the faded wedding photograph. Only the journal remained in her hands, proof that her life had once begun elsewhere. The man watched her in silence, then said, with steady calm, "My name's Ethan McGraw. I reckon you'll be needing some help." Clara gripped the journal, torn between refusing and proving she could stand alone. Yet when her gaze met Ethan's, she saw no trace of condescension, only resolve, the kind born from a man who had known loss himself and understood that sometimes a soul could not shoulder everything alone. The last light of day stretched their shadows long across the platform dust. Clara did not know what lay ahead. Only this. In that moment, when a hand reached for her in a world that turned cold, something in her heart, sealed hard as stone, cracked open just enough for the light to slip in. The next morning, Clara woke in the small rented room above a boarding house near the main street. The place was a 2-story wooden structure, a little worn, its hallway uneven, but the landlady, a widowed woman of years, agreed to let Clara stay for less if she would help in the kitchen and wash dishes. Clara accepted at once, knowing the little money she had left could not be spent loosely. The room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a rickety table, and a window that looked toward the far hills. At night, the wind crept through the cracks in the boards, carrying with it the scent of dust and dried grass. Clara spread her thin shawl across the pillow, placing her Bible and her journal beside the bed, as if to remind herself she still carried a root from the life she had lost. That morning, while she worked in the kitchen, the landlady asked what she planned to do for a living. Clara said she could read, could keep accounts, and hoped to teach. The woman thought a moment, then suggested, "The town school lacks someone for the little ones. You might speak to the headmaster." Clara knew it was a rare chance. She straightened her dress, drew her shawl tighter, and carried her Bible as if it were a talisman. The schoolhouse was nothing more than a broad cabin with a blackboard, its shingles cracked, windows rattling in the wind. A few children played barefoot in the yard, their clothes thin and worn. When they saw Clara, they whispered among themselves. The headmaster, a bearded man with silver in his whiskers, looked her up and down, skepticism plain in his eyes. But when she spoke of tutoring back east and held the Bible in her hands, he gave a slow nod. "We need someone, but be ready. The children can be rough, and not every parent will take kindly to a teacher. Different." His pause on that word told her what he did not wish to say outright. Clara bit her lip, then answered simply, "I will do my best." Her first day at the front of the class pressed heavy on her chest. Inside, the room was bare. One blackboard, a few crooked desks. 20 children sat scattered, their voices rising in chatter. When Clara entered, they stared. A blond boy laughed aloud. "Look, a colored teacher from back east." The others burst into giggles, some covering their mouths, some mocking her voice when she greeted them. Shame rose in her throat, burning. She remembered the nights in the East when her husband's family had called her a curse, the way they pushed her from the table, the stares that stripped her of worth. Now, Here in this strange land, the same scorn echoed. For a heartbeat, Clara nearly dropped the chalk and fled. But she clenched her Bible tighter, drew in a breath. She saw her mother's face, the frail woman who died too soon, who had whispered prayers each night, teaching her daughter, "You must stand tall, even when the world would have you bow." Clara opened the Bible, her voice trembling yet clear. "We'll begin with a story. Do you know of the lost lamb?" The room quieted. A few small heads lifted in curiosity. Clara seized the moment, weaving the tale gently, painting with words. The green pasture, the wandering lamb, the shepherd who sought it without giving up. By the end, some laughter had stilled. A handful of us eyes shone with attention. She set the book aside, smiled faintly, and wrote the first letters on the board. "We'll learn to read and write, and each of you will write your own name, so none can call you ignorant again." The noise dimmed. Some still crossed their arms, defiant, yet others leaned forward, watching the chalk draw shapes they longed to master. By day's end, Clara's hands were chalk-stained, her dress damp with sweat. Outside, parents waited, their gazes sharp. One woman whispered to another, "A widow from the east," and colored. "She won't last long." Clara heard, her heart tightening, but she bowed politely and said nothing. Back at the boarding house, the landlady handed her a warm cup. "They'll test you, but if you endure, they'll have no choice but to see." Clara lifted the drink, its dry grass scent rising, and nodded silently. She had not won them, not yet, but she had not run either. That night, under the flicker of a kerosene lamp, Clara opened her journal and wrote her first words since leaving the East. First day. Mud, mockery, cold stares. But I stood and taught till the end. I did not give in. Mother, I hope you see me. Beyond the window, the wind carried dust and hoofbeats through the small town street. Clara closed the journal, set it by her pillow, and whispered to herself, "Though they laugh, though they doubt, I will find my place here." By the second week, Clara had begun to settle into the rhythm of the town. Each morning she stood before her small class in the weathered schoolhouse. The children were still unruly, still mischievous, but their eyes carried less scorn than before. A few whispered questions about letters. Others lingered after the bell to sound out words. With patience, Clara realized, she had planted the first fragile seeds. In the afternoons, when the schoolyard emptied, she often sat alone copying lessons. Sunlight streamed through the leaky roof, casting bright shafts across floating dust. The desks were worn, eaten through by insects, and the long table in the corner, where she kept her books, had lost a leg. Each touch sent it wobbling toward collapse. That day, as Clara bent to wedge a broken brick beneath it, the sound of hooves carried across the yard. She looked up through the open window and saw a man on horseback ride into the gate. The horse was a dark bay, broad-shouldered, its legs powdered with trail dust. The rider wore a wide-brimmed hat, his frame straight, his coat of sun-worn leather catching the light. Clara's breath caught when she recognized him, the man who had reached for her at the station, Ethan McGraw. He dismounted, pulling a wooden crate and a bundle of planks from his horse. The few children left behind paused in curiosity, but Ethan gave them only a brief nod and strode toward the porch. "Heard the school needed lumber. The headmaster asked me to bring it," he said, his voice low and steady. Clara stepped out quickly, chalk dust still on her hands. "Thank you." It's just in time. Their eyes met, only for a heartbeat. His gaze held no judgment, no easy warmth, only a quiet steadiness, like water running deep and unseen. Yet Clara felt a ripple inside her chest, sharp and unexplainable. Ethan set down the boards, then noticed the broken table leg. Without a word, he knelt, pulled a hammer and nails from the leather pouch at his belt. Clara opened her mouth to protest, then fell silent, watching as he turned the table over and checked the joints. His movements were practiced, each blow of the hammer ringing sure and solid, filling the silence of the room. Clara stood close by, observing. Shafts of late sunlight caught the sweat beading at his brow, trailing along the rugged lines of his face. His shoulders were strong, his motions efficient, the gestures of a man too familiar with fixing what life left broken. In moments, the table stood firm again. Ethan rose, wiping his hands on his coat. "That'll hold for a few more years," he said simply. Clara's voice faltered as she answered, I'm truly grateful." He gave a brief nod, no more, and carried the crate to the back of the school. The children trailed him in curiosity, but he kept to himself, quiet and unyielding. When his work was done, he replaced his hat, tightened the reins, and prepared to leave. Clara lingered at the doorway, watching, feeling stirred inside her, part warmth, part unease. Gratitude for his help, yet confusion at his silence. He was unlike any man she had met in this town. No sly remarks, no lingering stares, only a presence, firm and unreadable, leaving her unsettled. As Ethan set his foot in the stirrup, Clara called out, "Mr. McGraw, thank you for fixing the table." He glanced back, a faint curve at the corner of his mouth, then dipped his head. "It was nothing," he replied, and with a press of his heels, the horse carried him away, leaving a cloud of red dust in his wake. The gate swung closed behind him, but Clara stood there still, her skirt shifting in the breeze. She felt, inexplicably, that from that moment, the quiet figure of the cowboy had etched himself into her life, like a comma placed before the start of a sentence yet to be written. That night, back in her room at the boarding house, Clara lit the kerosene lamp and opened her journal. She wrote, "Today, I saw the man from the station again. He brought lumber, fixed the broken table without a word. No needless speech. I am grateful, and yet my heart is restless." She laid the pen aside, staring at the flickering light. Was this only a passing kindness, or the beginning of something larger, something I dare not yet name? One late autumn afternoon, the Montana wind rose fierce. Gray clouds rolled down from the mountains, warning of rain. The school had just emptied, children scattered across the yard, their bare feet stirring the red dust into clouds. Clara lingered inside, gathering torn notebooks into a wooden chest. Outside, the sound of hooves thundered urgent, sharp as the storm pressing near. She looked up and saw Ethan riding hard through the gate, reins tight in his grip. Suddenly, the horse reared, front hooves lashing the air. Clara gasped, hurrying to the porch. Ethan tried to steady the beast, but in a single violent motion, it flung him sideways onto the gravel. The yard froze silent, the only sound the wind. Ethan pushed himself up at once, no cry of pain, but his right hand bled, torn raw against the stone. Clara rushed across the dirt, skirts sweeping the ground. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice taut with worry. "Just a scrape," he answered flatly, brushing dust from his coat. But Clara saw the blood seeping dark across his palm. Without thought, she pulled the white cloth she always carried, knelt before him. "Let me bind it." He started to refuse, but her gaze held firm. Trembling though her hands were, she reached for his. He stayed silent, letting her lift his battered hand. She dipped the cloth into her small water flask, cleaned the cut, and wound the fabric snug. Her fingers, fine and soft, moved carefully over the hardened ridges of his skin. Ethan sat still, watching her every motion. In that silence he felt something rare, tenderness, something he had long believed gone from his life. The wind whipped loose curls across Clara's cheek. She bit her lip, focused, though her hand shook faintly. Ethan looked down, finding in her dark eyes a quiet determination, and for the first time in years, he did not feel alone. "When I lived back east," Clara whispered, as though to steady herself, "I cared for my father. He fell often, his hands scarred. I know what to do." Ethan nodded once, no words, only a silent gratitude. When she finished, Clara exhaled, lifting her face. The nearness startled her. The blue of his eyes was not cold after all, but deep, still, like a winter lake. Flustered, she drew her hands away, smoothed her dress. "You should rest. Don't use it too much." A faint smile ghosted across Ethan's lips. "Thank you." Clara gave a quick nod and turned aside, her heart pounding, uncertain if it was fear or something else. In the days that followed, a silent thread began to weave between them. They spoke little, yet small signs appeared, forming a language of their own. Some mornings Clara found a full water jug set by the door. No one claimed it, but she knew. On a rainy night, the roof above her class dripped onto a desk. By morning, new boards had been set in place. No words, only a distant nod across the yard. Her own nod returned. At the market, she bought plain bread, but when she unwrapped it later, she found a sweet bun folded inside. The landlady said someone had sent it. Clara did not ask. That evening, seeing Ethan lead his horse past the schoolyard, pausing just a second, she understood. Such gestures, small yet steady, pressed against the hardness of her heart. From the woman scorned as a bearer of misfortune, mocked on her first day, she now felt the truth. Someone had noticed, even cared. Ethan, for his part, offered no declarations. Once betrayed, once abandoned, he had little trust left for words. He let his care live only in deeds. Yet when he looked at Clara, he saw his own reflection, fear, loss, and a quiet hunger for peace. One evening, Clara sat at her boarding house window, lamplight soft on her face. She opened her journal. "Today I bound his hand. My fingers shook, but he did not pull away. I don't know what it means, only that, for a moment, I was not wholly alone." Her shadow fell slender but unbroken across the wall. Outside, the wind swept dust along the narrow street, the pulse of frontier life carrying on. And somewhere in the dark, a quiet man left behind small traces, each one binding Clara more firmly to this place. The bond had no name yet, but it existed. Steady as a nod returned, sweet as a hidden loaf, warm as the rough hand she first took on that red-dusted station platform. In a small town with few stories to trade, the arrival of a colored widow from the Far East, living alone in a shabby rented room yet teaching their children, soon became the hottest subject whispered on every corner. At first, the talk was idle curiosity, but slowly, the whispers sharpened into judgment. Questions rose. Was a woman like her fit to teach their young at all? The spark was struck by Henry Callahan, owner of the largest general store in Dust Creek. Past 40, widowed 3 years, he carried weight not just for his wealth, but because he controlled the flow of essentials: sugar, flour, salt, cloth. A heavy man with a flushed face, his smile ever plastered, his eyes glimmering always with calculation. From his shop doorway, Henry often watched Clara pass on her way to the schoolhouse. At first it was polite nods, then easy remarks. "Fine morning, Miss Whitmore. Hard to manage alone, isn't it? If you need anything, my door is open." Clara answered only with the barest courtesy, refusing to be drawn in. Yet she felt the weight of his gaze trailing her long after she had gone. One afternoon, as Clara purchased dried beans at market, Henry stepped close, hat turning in his hand. "Miss Whitmore, you need a firm roof to shelter under. A woman alone with no kin here can find it hard. I have a fine house and it lacks a woman's warmth. You see what I mean?" Clara froze, heat burning her cheeks with shame. She spoke softly but firm. "I can provide for myself, Mr. Callahan." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him with a smile gone stiff. But from that day, rumors spread. In the saloon, men murmured that the wealthy storekeeper was generous enough to take interest in the widow schoolteacher. At market, women eyed Clara with a strange mixture of pity and scorn. A few parents began hesitating to send their children. "Who knows what a woman like that might teach them?" they muttered. Clara heard enough to know. The landlady sighed, her voice thick with pity. "They're bold behind closed doors. But mind yourself, Henry Callahan doesn't take kindly to being refused." The classroom grew heavy. Some children, having heard their parents, mocked her openly. "Are you going to be Mrs. Callahan?" one boy jeered, and the room erupted in laughter. Clara bit down on her lip, held the chalk steady, and pressed on with the lesson while her heart twisted in shame. One evening, walking along the main street, Clara saw Henry planted on his shop steps, speaking with several parents. As she passed, every eye turned on her, silent, pressing. Clara kept her back straight, her steps even, but inside she trembled. That night, by the flicker of her oil lamp, she wrote in her journal, "They do not believe me. I only wish to teach letters, to let children hold a pen and write their name. But in their eyes I am a drifting ghost, needing a rich man to make me proper. They do not see me. They see only my skin, my past, my solitude." Her pen stilled, tears blotting the page. Loneliness clenched harder than it had since her first day in Dust Creek. The next day, Clara left the classroom to find a cluster of mothers waiting at the gate, their gazes cold. One spoke loud enough for her to hear. "A teacher like that! What will she put in our children's minds?" Clara pressed her lips together, said nothing, walked on. Each step was heavy as stone. In their eyes, she was still an outsider, rootless, without claim to this place. Back at the boarding house, the landlady offered comfort. "They're used to women leaning on men. You're different, so they're afraid." Clara only nodded, her weariness gnawing away at her strength. One evening, after lessons ended, Clara sat alone in the empty schoolhouse, the walls golden in the setting sun. Her hand rested on the desk Ethan had once repaired. She thought of the water jugs, the sweet rolls, the small, wordless kindnesses he left behind. Gratitude warmed her, but memory of the town's eyes closed over her again like a shroud. Were those small mercies enough to anchor me here? She wondered. Outside, wind whipped red dust into spirals. The town bustled on, its prejudice intact. Clara sat silent, realizing the fight ahead was more than earning her bread. It was for her place, her right to stand. And yet, as her eyes fell on the scattered pages of children's scrawled letters, she knew she could not walk away. Scorned, whispered against, she would remain, if not for herself, then for the children, and for the dignity of her own unyielding name. Night fell thick and fast over the frontier town. No moon, only a scatter of dim stars blurred behind drifting clouds. In her narrow boarding house room, Clara sat by the window, looking down on the main street now emptied of people. From the saloon at the far end came the faint wail of a violin, mingled with the laughter of drunken men. But to her it was only distant noise, unable to touch the hollow ache twisting inside her. All that day, rumors had struck at her like invisible knives. Whispers in the market, outside the schoolhouse, even in the boarding house itself, all circling around Henry Callahan and the future wife he had claimed her to be. Clara had walked beneath those stairs, back held straight, but by the time she returned to her room, her legs felt ready to buckle. She drew her journal from the battered case, laid it across her lap. The oil lamp flickered, casting her thin shadow against the wall. Her fingers trembled as she opened a blank page, but no words came. Instead, tears welled, hot and heavy, falling until the paper blurred. She whispered, as though to the dark itself, "I don't know how to be loved. Every time I trust, I lose everything." Her voice cracked. Memories surged, the death of her husband in the epidemic, the only man who had once walked proudly at her side, the cold eyes of his family, condemning her as a curse. Nights huddled alone, praying for a hand to hold, answered only by silence. Fear had trailed her ever since, binding her to the belief that love would always end in loss. And now, though she had fought to stand in this place, though she tried to prove her worth, the same scorn had cut her open again. A knock came, soft, hesitant. Clara started, hastily wiping her face. The landlady never knocked this late. She cracked the door, and the lamplight from the hall revealed a tall figure, hat brim shadowing half his face. Ethan McGraw. He did not enter, only stood in the doorway, the bandage still wrapped around his hand. "I was passing by. Saw your light still burning," he said quietly, as though not to break the silence. Clara lowered her head, unable to speak. Her throat ached, her eyes still wet. Ethan saw, but asked nothing. After a pause, he added simply, "I brought some lumber for the school. Tomorrow the roof won't leak." The silence stretched. Then Clara's lips moved before she could stop them. "I don't know how to be loved." Ethan stilled. In the dim lamplight, his face gave nothing away, but his eyes, dark blue, fathomless, held hers. Clara's voice shook. "Every time I trust, I lose everything. Mother, father, husband, all gone. And when I think I've found a place, it's torn away." She clutched her journal to her chest, tears breaking loose again. She expected him to leave, as others had. But instead, his voice came, low, steady. "Then let me teach you." 4 plain words. No promises, no ornament. Yet they fell into Clara's heart like a spark, burning away the fog of despair. She lifted her gaze. His eyes held no pity, no demand, only quiet certainty. Clara broke. Tears streamed down her face, soaking the journal. But within that storm came the first fragile glimmer of hope. Ethan did not move closer, did not crowd her grief. He only stood, letting her cry, giving her the dignity of her own sorrow. His silence itself was a kind of respect, an acceptance that she was allowed to be broken, yet not alone. When her sobs eased, she whispered, "Why? Why would you do this?" Ethan looked down, flexing his bandaged hand. "Because I know loss, and because no one should spend a lifetime believing they're unworthy of love." To Clara, the words were more than comfort. They were recognition. Someone had seen her, truly seen her, not as rumor or shadow, but as a woman carrying wounds too long. The lamplight cast their shapes across the walls, her slender figure at the window, his tall frame in the doorway. Between them lay a distance not yet crossed, but also a bridge just laid down. That night, Clara wrote in her journal, "He said, 'Then let me teach you. For the first time I believe it may be possible.'" The ink was shaky, blurred with tears, but that page marked a turning, the moment Clara allowed her heart to be lit by a whisper. Rumor in the town did not fade. It spread like fire through dry grass. Henry Callahan still planted himself at the doorway of his store, his gaze on Clara lingering with possessive intent. Many whispered that marriage was only a matter of time, for Callahan was not a man used to rejection. One evening, with the sun bleeding red across the horizon, Ethan McGraw reined in his horse and rode straight to Callahan's store. He was not a man who sought crowds, but his face was set like stone, his eyes resolved. Inside, Henry looked up from counting his stock, lips curling in a mocking smile. "McGraw," he drawled, "what brings you here?" Ethan set his calloused hands flat on the counter, his voice low and cold. "Leave Clara Whitmore be. If you keep pressing her, I won't stand idle." Henry's laugh rumbled through his thick frame, his belly shaking beneath the waistcoat. "That widow? You think yourself a knight come to save her? She's a colored woman, unwanted, unclaimed. I was merciful to even offer. A woman like that has no place in this town." Ethan did not bite at the insult. His gaze, sharp as steel, cut straight through the man. "I said what I came to say. Don't touch her." The room thickened with silence. A few bystanders held their breath, sensing a line had been drawn. Ethan turned on his heel, tall frame rigid, leaving Callahan behind, with his smirk fading into a scowl. But Henry was not the only storm on the horizon. Clara's past, thought buried on the far side of the mountains, came rushing back without warning. On a fog-laden morning, as Clara stood before her class, the schoolhouse door slammed open. Two men entered, cloaked in Eastern coats, their bearing sharp, eyes cold. The children hushed instantly. Clara went pale. She knew them at once, the cousins of her late husband. "Clara Whitmore," one spoke, his voice ringing harsh in the wooden room. "Did you think you could run forever? Our family does not allow it." The class stirred nervously. Clara stood frozen, her heart hammering. "You will return east with us," the other pressed, "or we'll see it known in court. You schemed for inheritance, profited from your husband's death. They'll see your true face, a woman who exploits grief for gain." The words carved into her like knives. Memories flooded. Her husband's funeral, the family's cold dismissal, the cruel whispers that she had brought plague and ruin. Nights curled in darkness, labeled a curse. And now, that nightmare stood before her once more, here in the far west. Her lips trembled, her eyes blurred with tears. The children stared at her in frightened silence. Then came the pounding of hooves outside. Ethan appeared in the doorway, reins gripped hard, his face dark. With a glance, he understood. Clara shaking, the strangers pressing close, fear suffocating the room. He stepped in, his voice low and edged. "Who are you, and what business have you here?" "Us elder," cousin sneered. "We're kin to her dead husband. We've the right to bring her back." Clara opened her mouth, voice breaking. "Ethan, they—" Her words failed. Ethan didn't look at them. He looked at her. His eyes, steady as stone, anchored her in place. Yet inside, fury rose hot. His hand gripped the reins so tight the veins stood out. He could drive them off with his fists, but he knew this was not a fight to be won with violence. He swallowed the anger down, his words deliberate. "If you've business, it won't be done here. This is a schoolhouse. You'll leave now." The men chuckled, but they stepped back, their threats lingering in the air as they went. Clara stood trembling, her eyes wide with dread. Ethan led his horse outside, but his hand still shook faintly on the leather. A decision burned inside him. This was no longer about rumor or pride. It was about Clara's survival. And he knew the real fight had just begun. That night, Clara clutched her journal, eyes raw from weeping. Outside, Ethan leaned against a wooden post in the yard, staring at the dark sky. The wind cut cold, but the fire in him burned hotter. Clara would not be dragged back into that nightmare. His fist tightened on the reins until his knuckles turned white. A vow echoed in him. If they wanted to take her, they would have to go through him. But not with fists, not with guns. He would stand in the open, before the whole town, and turn every lie into light. The storm had broken, and Ethan knew if Clara was to have peace, he would have to fight for it, not in shadows, but in full view of Dust Creek. That morning, Dust Creek's square swelled with more people than usual. Rumor had run swift. The colored widow, claimed by her late husband's kin, was to be hauled back east. Yet Ethan McGraw, the silent cowboy, a man who rarely stepped into others' affairs, had brought her instead to the town's courthouse for judgment. Folks gathered not only from curiosity, but to see whose side the law would favor, the men of money and standing, or a lone outcast woman. Clara sat stiff on the pine bench, hands clutched tight around her mother's worn Bible, fingers ice cold. Her heart thundered, as if it longed to flee her chest. The scent of damp timber, the shuffle of boots across the floor, pressed the air heavy. Never had she imagined her very right to exist would be tested before the gavel. Beside her, Ethan sat immovable, solid as rock. He did not glance her way, but one broad hand rested lightly against the back of her bench, steady as a shield. In the pale light falling through the window, his face was carved with quiet resolve. Judge Howard, white-haired and stern, struck the gavel. "We'll begin." The two men from the east stepped forward, her husband's cousins. Their coats were finely cut, brass buttons polished, their stance designed to impress. One spoke with a practiced sweetness, venom beneath the gloss. "Your Honor, we are the only rightful kin of the deceased, Clara Whitmore's husband. We've come to reclaim her, for we fear she seeks to exploit the widow's name to claim inheritance not hers." Murmurs rippled through the room. suspicion falling like a draft of cold air. The second man pressed on. She fled west, took up teaching, abandoned propriety. That is evasion, plain. We ask the court to recognize the family's authority and compel her return east. Clara's knees trembled. Their words were lies dressed in half-truths, yet sharp as whips. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed, her voice strangled inside. Then Ethan rose, his voice cut clear, not raised, but firm as iron. "Your Honor, I have witnesses." All eyes turned, startled. The door creaked open. Mrs. Hargis, the stout boarding-house keeper, entered with steady steps. She dipped her head to the bench, then said, "I don't know the ways of court, but I know what I've seen." When Clara came here, she had nothing but a worn-out case. If she were scheming for riches, would she be living in a cramped room, scraping by on a schoolteacher's pay? The murmurs shifted. Next came old Mr. Jeffers, leaning on a cane, once a business partner of Clara's father-in-law. His voice rasped, but it struck true. "I was at the funeral back east. I heard their family call her a curse, drive her out with no shelter. If they say she abandoned them, that's a lie bold as day." Clara's breath caught. She had never expected anyone to stand for her. Then parents of her pupils spoke, plain folk of the town. They testified she had taught their children with patience, even from the Bible itself. "My boy can sign his name now because of her," one father said. The room buzzed louder. For the first time, Clara felt the tide turn. The Eastern men paled, words stumbling, but Judge Howard raised a hand for silence. His gavel struck, voice ringing. "After hearing all, the court finds Clara Whitmore bound by no obligation to return east. She is free. No man has claim to her, nor right to slander her name. This judgment is final." Bang! The sound cracked through the chamber like thunder. Clara wept, but not from shame. These were tears of release. Her body shook, but with relief, the invisible chains at last undone. Ethan settled back, his eyes gentling. He watched her bow over the Bible, her shoulders trembling, and in his chest rose a warmth fierce as any fire. At last, she could lift her head and live unburdened. When they stepped outside, the crowd parted, lining the way. Eyes that once held doubt now carried something else. Regret, even respect. Mrs. Hargis wrapped Clara in a stout embrace. "Daughter, no one will call you outcast again. You belong here." Clara nodded, tears still glistening. Across the square she found Ethan's gaze. He said nothing, only gave a small nod. But to her it was a vow. She was no longer alone. Above them, the gray clouds broke, revealing a clear stretch of blue. The storm had passed, and for the first time, Clara believed there could be calm skies meant for her. After the trial at Dust Creek, the air around Clara shifted. Eyes that once cut sharp with scorn now lowered when she passed. No one dared speak aloud of the greedy widow or the outsider woman. The town had seen the gavel fall, had heard the judgment, and though prejudice still lingered like smoke under rafters, Clara knew she had earned a place. But more than that, from that day forward, she began to notice one face, always there in the smallest turns of her life: Ethan McGraw. One misty morning, Clara stepped from the schoolhouse gate as a cold rain swept across the street. The chill bit at her shoulders, and she hugged herself for warmth. Then a tall figure appeared, silent, and laid a heavy coat across her back, smelling of leather and wood smoke. Clara lifted her gaze. Ethan stood beside her, brim of his hat shadowing rain from his blue eyes. "You'll catch the chill," she whispered. I can take it, he said simply. Then he turned away, leading his horse through the drizzle, leaving behind a warmth that outlasted the rain. Another evening, after a storm had battered the roof until water dripped into the classroom, Clara set buckets along the floor. But when she came the next morning, the leaks were gone. Fresh pine planks shone above, resin still sharp in the air. She knew who had been on that roof through the dark storm. Later, standing at the doorway, she caught sight of Ethan tightening his horse's reins. They met eyes. A single nod each way was enough. There were evenings when she returned to her room to find a small bundle waiting, a sweet bun wrapped in oiled paper. The landlady only said, "Someone left it for you." Clara did not ask. She only unwrapped it, tasting sugar on her tongue, heart trembling at the memory of the last time someone saved her a morsel. Her mother, long ago, pressing half a dry loaf into her hands. Now care had returned, in the shape of a quiet cowboy. The days passed gently. Clara still stood before her pupils, still faced the lingering weight of doubt in some parents' eyes. But beneath the burden grew a new rhythm. A full water jug by the schoolhouse door, the sight of a horseman passing when she swept the yard, a light knock at the window just to be sure she was safe. Ethan gave no promises, spoke no poetry, yet each silent act loosened the knots around her heart. One autumn dusk, Clara sat by her window, journal open. Her hand moved slowly across the page. I once believed I would never open my heart again. But these days, someone has knocked patiently, not with words but with deeds, a coat in the rain, a roof patched against the storm, a sweet bun saved for me. I do not know what to name it, only that my heart is no longer silent. She set down her pen, listening to the patter of rain against the eaves, and beneath it, to the steady rhythm of her own pulse. A fragile shoot had broken through the barren soil, still small, not yet love, but no longer desert. That night. Lights flickered through the town. Clara saw him at the edge of the horse corral, mending a saddle beneath the glow of the forge. Firelight traced the lines of his face, the strength in his hands. She lingered at the slope, eyes fixed on him. Her heart stirred with something she could not yet name. She remembered that night of tears, when she had whispered, "I don't know how to be loved." And he had answered, "Then let me teach you." Now those words were no longer only a whisper. They were being written into her days, steady and real. One morning, arriving early, Clara found a jar on her desk, filled with wildflowers, purple and gold, gathered hastily from the hills. No note, no name. Yet she smiled, fingers brushing the petals, knowing whose hand had cut them from the mountain grass. Looking outside, she caught only the trail of red dust and the silhouette of a rider fading into distance. Her heart lifted, not with fear, but with warmth. These new days were not loud, not grand. They were stitched from simple gestures, quiet threads. Yet it was those threads that began to unlock the heart she had thought sealed forever. Clara no longer shrank when she walked the street. She lifted her chin, her step firm. Because she knew, somewhere nearby, someone watched over her, not to bind, not to own, but simply to make sure she was safe. And in that knowledge, Clara began to hear the faintest whisper of her own heart. Perhaps I am learning. Perhaps I can be loved. By day, Clara had begun to find a measure of peace. In the little schoolhouse, the children's voices rose and fell in halting rhythm. Pages rustled. Sunlight streamed through wooden panes and caught the chalk dust in a golden haze. In those hours, she believed she could stand firm, could begin anew. But at night, all changed. The boarding room lay silent save for the wind seeping through cracks, the floorboards groaning beneath late footsteps. Clara lay awake in the dark, eyes wide, heart unsettled. Memories came back like ghosts. Her young husband burning with fever, his hand turning cold in hers. The in-laws casting her out, words sharp as whips. This girl brings misfortune. Even though the court had cleared her, even though the town now granted her place, the fear of loss still coiled inside her. It crept into her breath, haunted her dreams. She asked herself if she leaned too much on Ethan. Each time she recalled his quiet kindness, the coat in the rain, the mended roof, the wildflowers. Her heart warmed, yet panic rose beside it. What if he vanished? What if he left, like all the others she had loved? Then she would break. On sleepless nights she opened her journal and scratched only fragments. I am afraid. I am not ready. I want to trust, but I cannot. Then she closed the book, holding it against her chest, as though it alone kept her from shattering. Ethan saw. He did not ask, but he noticed. The shadows beneath her eyes, the slight thinning of her frame, the fleeting smiles that never lingered. Words were not his gift, but he knew Clara was fighting a war within, one no man could fight for her. One evening, after carrying wood to the landlady, he stood outside the boarding house, saw her lamp still burning. He lingered in silence, his shadow stretching across the empty street. He could have knocked, spoken comfort, but he did not. He knew forcing would only drive the wound deeper. Better to wait, to let her step free at her own pace. Another night, Clara found him at the stable, tending Thunder's hooves beneath the forge's glow. Sparks lit his face, stern and steady. She hovered at the doorway. Ethan glanced up, nodded once. No questions, no demands. He returned to his work, letting silence speak its own language. Clara stood long, listening to iron strike, the horse snorting softly. And in that silence she felt something stronger than any oath. Presence. Ethan never said he would stay, but every action, every quiet vigil declared it. One night she dreamed of her late husband turning away into darkness, deaf to her cries. She woke drenched in cold sweat, heart racing. Throwing open the window, she stared into the star-scattered sky, and far across the yard, by the fence line, a lantern glowed, the light from Ethan's stable. It was not lit for her, yet it burned all the same, patient, steady, a signal that she was not entirely alone. She sat there until dawn, her fear ebbing with the stars. The next day, Ethan rode by the school, dropping a bundle of lumber in the yard before riding on. No greeting, no lingering look. But Clara knew that was his answer. She might not yet be ready to speak trust aloud, but trust was not always forged in words. Sometimes it was found in the simple fact that someone kept showing up. That night she wrote, I am still afraid, but this time, I am not afraid alone. He does not press me, only waits, as if to say, you may step forward when you are ready. Perhaps that is what love truly is. Not demand, not force, but patience. She closed the journal, hand pressed to her chest. For the first time in years, though fear lingered, she felt a small sanctuary inside herself. Clara still woke in the dark, still startled at shadows, Yet the panic no longer devoured her whole. For now she knew, somewhere in the night, a lantern still burned at the stable. A small flame, steadfast, waiting for her to come closer in her own time. Spring came with banners and bright flags strung across the streets of Dust Creek. From dawn, townsfolk bustled about, erecting booths, hanging paper lanterns, tuning fiddles, preparing for the rare celebration after a long, brutal winter. Laughter mingled with hammer strikes and bowstrings, filling the air with a hum of expectancy. Clara wore a simple pale blue dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers gifted by her pupils. She was asked to join the children on the wooden stage to open the festival with a song. Yet as she stepped forward, her chest tightened. Memories of ridicule, the sting of whispers, still hovered like shadows. Her hand trembled, her voice wavered, nearly drowned beneath the crowd's murmurs. Then her eyes found his. Ethan stood among the crowd, tall in a plain white shirt, his gaze steady on her. It was not loud, not insistent, only a quiet strength that seemed to say, "You can." Clara drew a deep breath, fingers pressing the old Bible on the stand. Her voice rose clearer, stronger. The children chimed in, their notes ringing high, and soon the square filled with music that stilled the whispers. Heads nodded, faces softened. When the song ended, applause burst across the square. Clara bowed, heart racing, lifted by a strange exhilaration. And in that moment, she chose. She stepped down from the stage, through the cheering crowd, straight toward Ethan. Each step shed a fragment of fear. Reaching him, she stretched out her hand and took his, for the first time, in plain sight of all. The noise stilled, a hush rippling through the square. Some gasped, others whispered. But Clara did not care. Ethan's hand closed firmly around hers, warm and steady. His eyes softened, his voice low enough only for her. "You sang beautifully." Tears brimmed as she smiled. She had broken free of her cocoon of fear. Before the very town that once mocked her, she stood at Ethan's side, unafraid. The festival rolled on. Games, market stalls, cooking contests. Clara walked with her pupils through the booths, greeted now with nods instead of suspicion. Mrs. Hargis pressed a warm pastry into her hand, grinning wide. "You sang well, Clara. No one will dare say you don't belong here anymore." Clara smiled, a new feeling rising within her. Acceptance. Ethan remained close, never pressing, but always watching, his presence like a steady flame. For the first time, she felt safe in the midst of a crowd. At dusk, the fiddles struck up in the square, townsfolk circling for the reel. The children tugged at Clara's hands, begging her to join. She laughed, shaking her head, until she saw Ethan stepping forward, offering his hand, his eyes both gentle and certain. Her heart raced, but her hand rose of its own accord, slipping into his. Cheers rose as the circle spun, skirts and boots whirling under the fiery sky. Clara turned, laughter on her lips, hair loosed in the wind, and Ethan's eyes shone like a flame that would not waver when, though music stilled, they still held hands, breathless but smiling. Applause followed, not mockery this time, but acknowledgement. That night, lanterns glowed across the town. Clara and Ethan walked the quiet main street, golden light spilling over their faces. She clutched his hand, unwilling to let go. "I was afraid," she whispered, "but tonight, I know I am not alone." Ethan stopped, turned toward her, voice deep and warm. You never were, Clara, and if you'll have it, you never will be again. She rested her head against his shoulder, hearing the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in years, her own no longer trembled in the dark. It beat steady in the light. Back in her room, Clara opened her journal beneath the oil lamp and wrote, "Today, before them all, I took his hand, not for shelter, but to tell myself I no longer need to fear. I am learning to trust. Perhaps I am learning to love." She closed the book, smiling. Outside, fiddles still played faintly in the spring night, and within her heart, for the first time, spring had truly come. Dust Creek Square rang with fiddles, the stamp of boots, laughter spilling into the spring night. Yet through it all, Clara heard only the rush of her own heartbeat, and Ethan's whisper as he leaned close, lips nearly brushing hers. "You already are." His hand closed over hers, firm, unwavering. In his eyes, lit by the lanterns above, she no longer saw the cowboy who hid from feeling, but a man who had chosen to stand with her openly before every watching gaze. In that instant, the noise, the music, the crowd, all faded until only the two of them remained. After the festival, they left the square, walking the dirt road out of town. The night smelled of spring blossoms. Clara held his hand tightly, torn between relief and wonder. "I thought I'd live my whole life afraid," she whispered. "But now, I think I'm learning to walk a different way." Ethan stopped, turned to her, and lifted her chin until her eyes met his. His voice was low, a vow. "Clara, you never had to learn to be worthy of love. You already were. You just never had someone patient enough to show you. Now you will." Her breath caught, tears rising, but they were cleansing, not bitter. The days that followed, Dust Creek looked at her with new eyes. No one called her cursed anymore. Children ran to show her drawings. Parents nodded in greeting. And Clara knew this change wasn't just the trial or her teaching. It had come from the moment she stepped off that stage and took Ethan's hand before them all. A simple gesture, yet one that rewrote her place in their midst. One evening at the schoolhouse steps, the sun poured gold across the roof Ethan had mended. He arrived with a basket. "Mrs. Hargis sent this," he said simply. Clara smiled softly. "You always find ways to remind me I'm not alone." He scratched at his hair, eyes averted, but she caught the faint curve of a smile. No grand speeches were needed. Their language was already written in such small acts. That night, Clara wrote in her journal by the flicker of oil flame, "Perhaps I was never truly alone. God was always there. And now there is a hand that waits for me to take it. I once thought I could never be loved again. But tonight I understand. Love does not come when we are perfect. It comes when we dare to admit our fear, and someone still chooses to stay." Summer came, wildflowers spilling over the hills. At a gathering one evening, Ethan rose before the crowd and reached out his hand for her, not to dance, not to boast, only to show he would stand by her, no matter the eyes upon them. Clara took his hand, steady this time, her heart calm. "Do you remember when you said you didn't know how to be loved?" he asked. "I remember," she answered. "Do you know now?" Clara's eyes shone in the firelight. "Maybe I'm learning. Maybe I can be loved." Ethan bent close, whispering for her alone, "You already are." And this time Clara believed, her journal no longer filled with fear, but with notes of children's laughter, flowers on her desk, a dry roof in the rain. The woman once called cursed, who had wandered into town with nothing but a battered case and averted eyes, now walked with her head high. She had found her place. She had found the courage to believe she was worthy. And Ethan, the cowboy thought hard and silent, had shown that love needs no grand words, only patience and the quiet acts of every day. That evening, Dust Creek glowed with lantern light. Clara and Ethan stood on the boarding house porch, watching the street shimmer gold. "Ethan," she whispered, "is this what they call peace?" He smiled, drawing her close. "Not just peace. This is home. Your home, if you'll have it." Clara answered not with words, but with a nod, resting her head on his shoulder. At last, after years of loss, she no longer needed to prove herself to the world. Under the wide, silent stars of the West, their story did not end with grand promises, but with a hand held fast. Clara, once branded ill-omened, had found where she belonged, and Ethan had proved that love was not spoken in flourish, but lived in the steady light of patience. Dear friends, no matter our age, we can find something of ourselves in this journey. From loss to healing, from loneliness to the touch of a hand that does not let go. If this story brought back a memory, a lesson, or a long-buried feeling, I invite you to share it in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts so that these Wild West love stories continue to bring warmth and hope to us all.